Welcome everybody to Anti-Racism in the Workplace. I'm so excited to be having this important conversation and being joined today by our workplace legal expert, Antonio Urdaneta. And Antonio is the thought leader behind Workplace Legal. He is a marathon runner who improves the work climate and empowers business leaders, entrepreneurs, managers, supervisors, and human resources professionals to reduce the inherent threat of workplace relations by providing innovative training, advisory, investigations, and litigation services. Antonio uses coaching tools and skills to inform, advise, and represent workplaces in their virtual and physical challenges, including business transformation and managing toxic leadership. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Antonio over the last number of months, and he strikes me as just a really inspiring individual. I'm so glad to have you here, Antonio, to lead the presentation today and this important conversation. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather, for those beautiful words, and the inspiration is mutual. Thank you for organizing this and having all the participants. I'm delighted, as I said it in LinkedIn, to have the opportunity to speak about anti-racism in the workplace. This presentation is for general guidance only. The application and impact of employment, labor, and workplace human rights laws can vary widely based on the specific facts involved and the location in the world. Neither Heather nor myself are engaged in rendering legal advice. This is legal information, and as such should not be the substitute of a consultation with a licensed legal professional. Before taking steps, please consult with one. Okay, this is our time together. We're gonna see timelines for not just for anti-Black racism, where it comes from, but also our Aboriginal people's racism as well. Then we'll move to what it actually is and how it materializes, the avenues that it has to actually show up, and then we'll move to the workplace to see how that impacts the legal liability at some point. And then we'll use a few examples of what organizations and governments are doing in 2020 to tackle racism. It's very interesting what this opportunity that I had to review all this situation. So you see a lot of pictures here, a lot of dates, but the timeline in the bottom is Black racism. The racism, some points in time that Black people experience racism, or not just racism, but adverse experiences and circumstances. And the one on top is the timeline for our Aboriginal people. So whether it is a massacre in 1873 where 20 Aboriginal people were killed by a group of white men, or the kidnap of 12.5 million individuals from Africa brought to the Americas, it's a similar, not in circumstances, but it's a similar shock to our group's soul and emotions. Whether it is a cultural party, not cultural party, a cultural representation of our ancestors in 1884, when our Aboriginals were prohibited from celebrating a particular cultural ceremony, or the Underground Railroad that went from United States to Canada, extended through United States to Canada, where people were actually asking to be free, to regain freedom, or whether it is the residential schooling that Aboriginal children were experiencing after the 1880s, where they were taken from their families and put in these residences to gain the knowledge from what the conquerors or the group in power, how they saw the world, and disregarding the ancestors of these children and families. Rosa Parks, 1955, fighting against segregation in municipal buses. That was the time where she sat in the front of the bus as opposed to just going to the back of the bus. 1950, sled dogs, they were slaughtered. Why? Why they were slaughtered? Because it was an economic activity that the Aboriginal people had at that point, and apparently it didn't work out. However we want to justify slaughtering dogs, that there is no justification for that. They wanted to prevent the Aboriginal people from developing their economic activities. Or 1965, Selma to Montgomery, a 42-mile walk, 42-mile walk, talking about running a marathon. A marathon is 21 miles. This was 42 miles, and they were facing death when they got to Montgomery. And what they were fighting for was the right to vote. Aboriginal women disappearing in Canada today and murder, and we haven't fixed that in all this time. And we'll focus on Black Lives Matter. But you can see the pattern of experiences where it grows on groups of minorities that it wears people down. In 2020, anti-Black racism movement, you know about this, May 25th, George Floyd, a Black 46-year-old man who died at the knee of a white police officer who is now facing charges for second-degree murder. And it's a pattern that happens over and over again. And that's why we are probably taking a stronger position on, hopefully a stronger position against racism, not just anti-Black racism, but in other expressions. Why is this important for the workplace? What happens outside the workplace, especially when it's massively like this, it will impact the workplace inside. And that example of an officer who comforts a crying girl who asks, "Are you going to shoot us during protest?" is not something isolated. A lot of children, Black children, are traumatized by what's happening in the streets. Imagine that you're the parent of one of the parents of this child or children. How are you going to feel at work? You could try to leave problems at home, but I don't think I wouldn't be able to. Charlene, 37 years old. I overheard a racist conversation. This is now inside the workplace. I overheard a racist conversation and was offended by what was said. The first response of human resources was, "I'm sure they didn't mean any harm." You can see that with that comment, Charlene is already losing that confidence on the company, on the human resources department. Another comment from a Black Gen X woman in management. If I were to say to my supervisor, "I don't know what I want to do, but I want to change my job," that's like saying you don't have it together. But I have coworkers who are white who say that all the time, and people move mountains to create positions for them. It may be a different manager. So one manager moves mountains for everybody, regardless of their ancestry, color of the skin. But there are managers within the same organization who are like this. And for these Black Gen X women in management, there is just one organization. Each story taken in isolation, the last one at the bottom, may seem trivial, but it's the cumulative effect that wears us down. And it's that wearing down that you saw over and over and over centuries, that it's wearing down, and reasonably so. I wanted to share with you this video that it's going to be about 3 minutes, a little bit more than 3 minutes, but it's actually an experience of racism in the workplace and the outcome. It actually is great for what we're going to be talking about today. So this is Dexter Brown's history.
Dexter Brown loves CBC.
I felt like home. It felt like I was giving back to Canada.
But Brown doesn't work here anymore. In April of 2019, he was at an all-staff meeting of the Fifth Estate. That's where they screened this documentary.
Half of them are black.
There was no warning they were about to hear the N-word 12 times. The thrust of the doc? How harmful the word is.
But why that? You see,
Because that's
why
what
that?
I heard growing up.
That's what I'm saying. So
I
are we
did.
going to continue it?
No,
So
sir.
we cutting that off right now.
Yes, sir.
In the discussion that followed, witnesses say host Gillian Findley and editor Loretta Hicks repeated the word. There were more than 30 people in the room, including new executive producer Catherine Legg and the head of investigative Marie Close. According to multiple witnesses, no one spoke up. Brown, a junior employee, was the lone black person.
Because they should have known better. I feel like they should have known that that word has a lot of power and it affects people.
In an email, Findley says she doesn't remember using the word, but says, if, however, my memory is wrong and I did quote someone from the film using the word, I apologize. It should not have happened. Hicks declined comment. Legg did not respond to multiple requests for comment. Close said she is unable to speak because of confidentiality.
This is the last place you go and think that you are going to hear someone say that word.
Nadia Stewart, the head of the Canadian Association of Black Journalists, was one of the first people Brown called.
We know the CBC can do better, and in this instance, definitely should have done better.
Emails show Brown briefly spoke to Legg the next day, but there was no resolution and no apology from colleagues.
Yeah, an apology would have been great. It would have meant a lot to me.
Brown lodged a complaint asking to be moved off the show. He says he was offered other temporary positions, including one under the same manager, but he wasn't satisfied with the options and stayed put. CBC hired an external law firm to look into work culture at the Fifth Estate, including the use of the N-word. When the investigation was over, he wasn't allowed to see the report.
Well, I was hoping to get a bit more information about what happened and steps that would be taken to address the issue, to make sure that something like what happened there wouldn't happen again.
In a statement, CBC says the investigation was comprehensive and confirmed corrective actions were taken, but couldn't say what they were, citing confidentiality.
The Weekly starts now.
But since the incident, host Wendy Mesley used the word twice in editorial meetings.
To know that another journalist of color had to face something kind of similar to what I faced, that was really tough.
In recent weeks, CBC has announced a number of changes to tackle systemic racism and increase diversity. It's too late for Brown, who took a job at CTV, but he still hopes for positive change at the public broadcaster.
And I hope that there are changes there, changes for the better, to make people of color feel welcome, accepted, appreciated.
Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Toronto.
Let me share with you 3 steps that I see in that situation from those 3 minutes, and change that we saw. These are the 3 escalated moments. First off, you have a junior employee, the only black person in a room with 30 people. Probably the ones who were leading that team, who used the documentary, they had the best intention in the world. I'm not going to say that they had a bad intention, but we know that with harassment, discrimination, the intention is not that important. What's important is the impact. You have 2 white leaders speaking about the video, using the N-word as well. And remember, this is a junior employee. Very excited about having probably the first full-time job with CBC, right? Another thing that he mentions is that no one spoke up. In the video, they mentioned that no one spoke up. So I imagine that Dexter went home feeling very bad, and then an email came to Legg, who was the executive producer. And after that, nothing happened for Dexter's expectations. And I put myself in Legg's position as well. I have all this work. I'm a new producer. I want to show that I'm valuable, that I can do stuff. And this email comes to me, and I have to handle that email now on top of everything else, right? And I didn't mean it, right? From the perspective that Lek may have. But there was no resolution, no apology. So Dexter requests, change me from this group. I don't want to work with this group. And CBC offers, well, we have other temporary jobs, including one job with the same manager that you're working with now. So imagine that that's your only choice, whether losing a full-time job for a temporary job, and anyways, ending up working in the same environment that I felt discriminated against. I'm not saying that they have to or they don't have to. I'm just saying what Dexter may have been feeling at that point. And by the way, workplace culture review, AKA workplace investigation. At some point, they mentioned that there was an investigation, a report. So what that tells me is that they treated Dexter's email or further communications as a complaint. Under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario and other health and safety legislations in Canada, an employer is expected to actually conduct an investigation within the circumstances. It depends on what the allegations are, where they can actually determine whether there is harassment or harassment specifically or violence. So they have to have that. They have to conduct that investigation. So in this second step is where I think things could change, because let me finish with the third step and then I'll come back to the second step, that derailment. The consequence of all of this, a year or 2 years later, is that Dexter is not working with the company that he was very excited to start working for. He's now working for CTV instead of CBC. I mean, I don't know in the industry what that means, but he was excited about CBC, now working on CTV. And he mentions an apology would have been fine. The apology that they mentioned in the video didn't happen when Dexter sent an email at the beginning. It happened later when the investigation, these type of investigations started. They should have known better, says Dexter. I want other people to feel that they are welcome, accepted, appreciated in the workplace. So other people like me, that they feel like that when they go to the workplace. And now CBC is taking measures to end systemic racism and increase diversity in their workforce. But what are the things that we could fix from all of this? I don't think that the third step, the last step before the employment relationship ends, could be fixed if we don't fix the first two. The first one is more about managing the one-on-one expectations or the group-to-one expectation about how to communicate or what to say, what not to say. But that's very difficult to keep control over. And we're talking about human beings in the workplace. We want them to feel free to speak their mind and do their work and so on, and be creative, innovative, and so on. So we don't want to jeopardize that. So it's very difficult that we are 24/7 on top of every employee saying, you're not supposed to say that, you're not supposed to say this, you're not supposed to do that, right? I think that the second piece is where the problem lies, and the one that could actually be fixed, because it's a process. You have an HR manager or an HR professional, you have a manager with a budget, and you have an employee with some expectations and some injury, some hurt, right? The manager is thinking about, this is not that big of a deal. Let's move on. Let's continue. We have tons of work, right? And I have a budget. The employee is saying, the company is not backing me up. I don't feel supported in the company. And the HR is balancing these two interests. So within that environment, there is nothing else that will happen but the mixed emotions later on. So I think that in the second step, we can do a lot. What is racism? Let's go a little bit deeper on this situation. Racism, and this is a definition of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which actually writes a lot about anti-discrimination, anti-harassment in the workplace. That's their mandate. Racism, they say, it's an ideology which directly or indirectly suggests that one group is superior to another group of people. That's what it says. So one group of people is superior than another group of people. And they make decisions based on that ideology. Second point that I want to talk about racism is what are the channels through which racism could materialize. It could happen person to person. In the workplace, a comment was said and it was a racist comment. That's easy to see, that's easy to point out, that's easy to fix, easier to fix than the others. The second one is the societal racism, which is the one on the right. I mean, that's how I projected there. And I'm going to read the definition that I chose for today. Is the formalization of historical cultural practices within a society then that puts one ethnic group or social group in a better position to succeed. And at the same time that that group is succeeding, by that group succeeding, it creates disadvantages for another group. And these happen over a period of time. And on top of that, the disadvantages grow over time. So that's the societal racism. The other one is the systemic racism, and that's embedded in normal practices within organizations, and it can lead to discrimination in employment. For example, I wasn't hired because I'm Black. I have all the skills and qualities and abilities that they are asking for the job, and I think that I'm the better prepared for that job, but I'm Black, so they didn't hire me. But they hire a white person, for example. So that's the systemic. For the systemic and societal, changes it's going to take longer for us to actually achieve those, but I'm happy that within all these bad circumstances that we are having the conversation and it's louder. How can racism materialize? And I'm extracting this, the way that I'm going to explain this is based on the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. It's not that they have this definition, it's just that racism could be materialized in these 6 grounds of the Human Rights Code: citizenship, color, ancestry, race itself, place of origin, and ethnic origin. When we file applications for discrimination or harassment at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, they recognize that race is connected with some other of the other 5 grounds that we're talking. So it's not disconnected from, so it could be race and ancestry, race and color, race and citizenship, a mix of a few of them. So that's not just what racism is, the channels where racism actually could go through, and on top of that, how they actually materialize. And basically making decisions against a person who has these grounds, reasons: race, color, ancestry, place of origin, citizenship, and ethnic origin. Again, I'm using that definition from the grounds of the Human Rights Code that are connected to race. The best way, the best experience that an employee would have in a workplace is where that workplace doesn't have harassment, discrimination, violence, and so on. So we stay in the workplace culture, managing the workplace culture with policies, education, and training. By the way, the Occupational Health and Safety Act orders employers to have, and they have to have it. It's not that I may have it because it's a good practice. It's actually that they have to have it. It's an anti-harassment and anti-violence policy in the workplace, whatever they want to call it, but it's with the goal of what it's inappropriate in the workplace that shouldn't happen. And if it happens, what is the company, what are the steps that that employee or the witness or the manager is supposed to do to fix it and to take measures from what the outcome of that fix is. So they have to have policies about anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, and sorry, no anti-discrimination, anti-harassment and anti-violence. By the way, harassment includes sexual harassment as well. So as long as you stay in the workplace culture and the policies and you educate, train, provide training to the employees, it's all right. The thing is that sometimes, well, not sometimes, but we cannot control human beings in the workplace, and things happen. So the things that are illegal, and you get closer to that, it depends on how long you leave the situation to by itself without fixing it. The things that are illegal are discrimination, harassment, violence, and reprisal. Let me pause here from the workplace culture and give some definitions about those: discrimination, harassment, violence, and reprisal. All of them illegal. Should not happen in the workplace, and if it happens, you are exposed to fines or litigation or bad public relations consequences. Discrimination, first of all, there is no definition of discrimination in the Human Rights Code. What the Human Rights Code of Ontario says is that an employee should be free from discrimination in the workplace because of all these race, color, and so on. But the Supreme Court of Canada, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and other decision makers in Canada have recognized that discrimination is a differential treatment. And not just a differential treatment, so I treat somebody differently in the decision-making process I'm on, but I also create a negative impact on that person. And not just I create a negative impact on that person, but I based my decision on a ground of the code, like race, color, ancestry, place of origin, and so on. And there is a connection between the negative impact and the decision based on the ground of the code. To put it another way, I wasn't given the job because I'm Black. The decision is, would I get the job, yes or no? I went to the interview, I provided my resume, the interview went well, but I wasn't given the job. The negative impact is evidently that I wasn't given the job. Somebody else was chosen over me, but I had all the qualifications. And then the only difference is that I'm Black and the other person is white. For example, I'm not picking up on white people, but it's just an example, easy contrast to make in discrimination. So negative impact, a decision was made, and there is a ground of the code involved. It could happen with gender. It could happen with disability. Today we're focused on racism. Harassment. The definition of harassment is a little bit tricky. It's packed with a lot of information, even though it's very short. It's a course of vexatious comments or acts or conduct that are known or ought to be known as unwelcome. So basically, that the person who is making the joke, the person who is making the comment, should have known better. It's what Dexter said with the group of people who were chose the documentary to use it in the workplace. They should have known better. They should have known that using the N-word in the workplace is not okay. At least should have participated him if he was okay with that, and then make a decision after that. So that's one thing. It's known or ought to be known to be unwelcome. The second thing is that it is a vexatious, meaning that the goal of the joke, comment, or act is to annoy the other person, the recipient. And what that tells me is that for harassment and discrimination and all of these definitions, it's not that important what the person who is doing it intends to do. My intention could have been the best intention in the world. I wanted to show our employees how bad the N-word in the workplace is. However, what is important for harassment is the impact. So the impact on Dexter in this situation. Make sense? Violence, it's a simple definition, simpler action or threat of action that may injure a worker. And reprisal is when an employer or a representative of the employer punishes an employee because that employee raised concerns, made a complaint about harassment. And that punishment somehow, reducing the hours of work, increasing the workload in order to affect performance of that employee, reducing salary. That doesn't, I mean, that's pretty straightforward that it is a punishment. Sometimes it's more subtle than that, but it could be any type of punishment. A few red flags for racism at work. I got this question the other day. A friend of mine asked me whether poison work environments or toxic leaders or microaggressions were illegal. And the answer is, well, it depends. It could be illegal if you can, the situation can be read as harassment or discrimination or sexual harassment or violence, right? Or reprisal. But in general, a poison work environment is a place of work for me, with a legal definition, is a place of work with pervasive discrimination or harassment. So discrimination that it's embedded in the workplace, that stays there. Be mindful that for some employees, this legal definition of poison work environment may be a little bit more, the bar may be lower. For them could be a comment that it's not even harassment, but that could be for that employee a poison work environment. So that's a red flag. Toxic leaders. Toxic leaders is those who use unethical, mean-spirited, there are many definitions of toxic leaders, by the way. Those who use unethical, mean-spirited, and sometimes illegal means to manipulate and annoy those around them to maintain or increase power, money, or a special status, or divert attention away from their performance shortfalls and misdeeds. And on top of that, when they relate, they connect with other employees in the workplace, they don't care so much about the work structure, or I mean the employees' work structure. They care more about who they like and who they trust. And peer-to-peer jokes. If you see these things, whether by a comment or you witness it somehow, there is something below, in that iceberg, there is something below the surface that may be growing up. So tackling the workplace culture may eliminate later the illegal things. I have a blog entry, and Heather, I'll share with you the slides so you can share with our participants. I have a blog entry talking about toxic leaders. It seems that, anyways, I'm not going to go too much on that. You can go on the blog and read a little bit, but it seems that companies think that because they seem to produce more and their financial numbers are high, the company's actually making profits. But I think, and there is a Harvard study that I mentioned there, that over time, that toxic leader actually makes the company lose money. All right. Or in the chat box. What are companies doing about racism in 2020, specifically Black racism? The best statement of all. This is Mercedes Petronas Formula One team. I'm not a Mercedes fan. I'm a Ferrari fan. And that's like saying Maple Leafs and the Montreal Canadiens team, that if you like one, you don't like the other. So the same thing here. I'm a Ferrari fan. I'm not a Mercedes fan. However, I recognize that they are the only team that actually made a statement. And the statement is their brand, they are recognized as the Silver Arrow. That's how you recognize Mercedes. Silver Arrow in Formula One. You recognize Ferrari as the prancing horse. That's their brand. So the Silver Arrow is Mercedes brand. Imagine how important that is. This year, because of the anti-Black racism movement and Black Lives Matter, they decided to use a black colored car. That's their statement. There's not much to say about that. By the way, they have the only Black driver in Formula One, and I believe in the whole history of Formula One, 70 years. who happens to be 6-time champion and all of that. But this is a bold statement, and they want to make sure that people understand their position. The second one is Apple. Tim Cook's CEO. He's speaking up about on racism, and he mentions here, this is a letter open and in their website, signed at the bottom by Tim Cook, probably written by somebody else, but they make sure that their statement is out there. Ontario passed a law in 2017, Anti-Racism Act. That was 2017, but now you can see in their website that they have a vision and they have goals. And goals, I think that we were talking about these, Heather, goals are long-term change across system. And they're looking to have some changes achieved by 2024. I'm not going to talk about Lewis Hamilton. By the way, this is the only black driver in Formula One. But I was listening to this interview like I listened to Dexter's, and I noticed a few things. They talked about, in a broad sense, about racism. They asked questions about why now this movement is happening. I have the link there. I'll share it with you if you want to listen to it. It's interesting that you have Lewis Hamilton on the left and a white man, a very influential white man in Formula One on the right, interviewing him. I point out also the masks. They have a lot of measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. One of the things that Lewis Hamilton mentioned, that also Dexter mentioned, is that he feels isolated and alone. And he feels that so Lewis Hamilton, 6-time world champion, feels that when he speaks to other people about racism, the people that he's speaking to or with feel offended, and that shouldn't happen. And other interesting points about racism in Formula One, black racism in this case. A couple of resources, and we're about to get to Q&A. A couple of resources, laws, evidently, the ones that I base my presentation on that are underlying this business approach: Human Rights Code of Ontario and the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And there are government agencies that have a lot of information out there about these particular laws. The Ministry of Labor and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Also, I'll share with you the links. Before we go to the Q&A, takeaways. Individuals, for us as individuals, for me as an individual, if I don't know, I prefer to educate myself and then ask questions. What that means is that while I was reviewing, I sensed that, and I think I read at some point that one black person, employee, felt that people went to him because he was the only one who knew about the topic, and he was actually bothered by it instead of feeling welcome by it or feel included by it. So that suggested to me that it's better to educate myself first and then go and ask questions. The second point for individuals is feeling the pain and feeling the privilege. What I mean by that is, I have, I'm going to disclose, I have a disability which is coping with depression and anxiety. And there is a particular trigger for that depression and anxiety. Fortunately, it's just one trigger. And that prevents me from doing things. It's like a barrier that I have, which makes me feel sad at some point, frustrated in others. But I mention that because that helps me to understand what they are experiencing in their barriers in the workplace. It's not the same, but the impact is the same. I feel that I cannot advance as much as I could, or that somebody else can. Yeah, it's a barrier. So I feel my pain. I mean, I don't feel my pain, but I remember what I feel and how I feel when I'm experiencing that pain. And that helps me understand others. And the privilege, all of us have, I mean, not many privileges, but in comparison with others, but we have some privileges. So I also gain a lot of understanding from my privileges when I appreciate something that I have, but I don't make the other group feel inferior because I'm in a better position about something. Make sense? Specifically for the workplace, and I'll open up for Q&A, and thank you for your patience. The outside conflict affects your employees' morale and evidently the productivity. This situation shouldn't be managed as business as usual, although you may have legal tools and practices that may be used as usual. This situation shouldn't be managed as business as usual. The change should start at the top, and I think that I'm preaching to the right choir. Change should start at the top. These type of changes doesn't start from the ground up. So leadership needs to participate. And not just participate, but genuinely cause change. And having legal tools and better legal practices is always, and not just, and when I mention that, it's not just that I have the legal tool and I put it in the drawer. I mean, I have the legal tool and I know how to use it, and everybody knows how to use it. With that, I'm gonna open to Q&A.
Well, Antonio, I thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to join us, to share your wisdom, your experience, and bring sort of the legal perspective to this important topic, so that we, whether we're coaches or in any other professions, business leaders in our own organizations, we have a good lens with which to champion this change.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it. And thank you for having me and for your patience.